This is an account of events described and written in a family Bible by a soldier, Thomas Chesters. Date of birth 5th August 1899. 101841. Private Thomas Chesters, 1-4 South Lancs, joined September 27th, 1916, at Warrington, drafted to number 19 Woodfield Road, Blackpool. October 21st, departed to Fleetwood to fire a rifle course and was billeted to Mrs. Dorcas, number 10 Carr Road, Fleetwood. Returned to Blackpool and on January 1st, 1916, returned home to Warrington on final leave. February 1st, 1916, departed for France and arrived at Southampton February 2nd and sailed to France. On the same night, on SS St. Anniv, February 3rd, 1916, arrived at Rouen, France, and went through rough course of final training for the trenches and remained there till the end of the month. On March 1st, arrived with the battalion in the trenches at Leigh, 21 miles east of Arras, and went through some rough work with the Lancashire Company of Field Engineers. On May the 21st, at Bellecourt, the platoon got trapped in a heavy bombardment, lost 29 men, and myself got buried and remained in Shell Hole for 4 hours and was carried to number 2 West Lancashire Field Ambulance. Number 2 post at Bellecourt 6 days after returned to battalion and commenced night work in no man's land facing Belleville Wood and remained there until July 1st. Comment from his granddaughter, Janet Peacock. My granddad ran away from home to join the army at 16 years of age. His mother went to the army headquarters to get him out, as he was too young. He then ran away again to rejoin the army. This time she left him there as he was so determined to fight for his country.
Early in the new year, the government was forced to introduce conscription because of the large numbers of deaths on the Western Front and the reducing numbers of volunteers at home. The first military service bill was passed by the House of Commons on the 24th of January. Under the bill, all single men aged from 18 to 41 would be conscripted, but with some exceptions, some exemptions. Some were exempted because their occupation was considered to be essential war work, such as miners. The medically unfit, conscientious objectors and ministers of religion were also exempted. Exemptions could be considered for those who had to run their own business or those who had a family they had to look after. Some employers applied for exemptions for their workers. One employer asked for an employee to be excused because he was the only one who could use the new bacon slicer. Appeals were made to local military tribunals. For just under half of those applying for exemption, their request was refused. Others were granted exemption for a limited time period. Conscientious objectors claim moral, religious and political reasons for refusing to fight, although some were willing to help the war effort by doing jobs such as working on a farm or acting as stretcher bearers. Others, known as absolutists, refused to aid the war in any way. Arthur Turtle, a local man who grew up in Tyldesley, was a fervent churchgoer and was given a certificate of exemption, but it was ignored when he was ordered to barracks. He refused to don a uniform, pick up a gun, or go to the barrack square for drill. Arthur was one of 13,600 who refused to take a non-combatant job. Treatment of men like Arthur was cruel and included starvation rations, total silence, floggings, infrequent visits, and constant insult. Some of them died in prison. Arthur served just under 3 years in Shrewsbury, Wormwood Scrubs and Strangeways jails and was released in 1919. Many conches, as they were called, were kept in jail long after the war ended to enable returning soldiers to get the first choice of any jobs. Unlike many other conches who were ostracised for cowardice for the rest of their lives, Arthur was treated with respect in Leigh all his life. He opened the health food store in Lord Street. He continually campaigned for peace and was instrumental in getting a crossing for elderly people, called Turtles Crossing, across Leigh Road at Atherley. He received a very complimentary obituary in the local paper when he died in December 1982. While he was in prison, Arthur kept diaries in which he wrote about his experiences and his conversion to Quakerism. Most of these and his other prison artefacts survived and are part of Wigan Borough Archives collection. 1,600 men were registered as conscientious objectors at the end of the war, and the government ordered all records of them to be destroyed, apart from a copy to be retained by them. Although the reason is not known, the records for Leigh were not destroyed and are currently stored in Wigan Archives, where they are being studied. Bravery took many forms. There were those like Alfred Wilkinson of Leigh, who won a Victoria Cross, yet conscientious objection was the sort of bravery which involved being in opposition to family, friends and colleagues for the sake of one's principles. Some, like Shadrach Critchley and his wife, opted out altogether, and their act was hardly one of cowardice. The war produced blind men too. Blinded by mustard gas, hundreds suffered ill health for life if they managed to survive the war. Those too exhausted, shell-shocked or mentally unfit for trench warfare were subject to the blindfold as they were shot, sometimes for just falling asleep. Then there were those such as Field Marshal Haig, who were blind to the consequences of arrogant policies, which resulted in a huge amount of needless slaughter. There were 60,000 British casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme on July the 1st, 1916, when they were ordered to go over the top. 1/3 of them died. Blind men, brave men, all gone now.
3 blind men, 3 brave men. 1 blind man, 1 blind man. Let's see how they run. Now where can they run? From enemy lines in the noise and the smoke, now poison gas and they start to choke. To avoid at all costs a conqueror's yoke. Our blind men, our fine men. 1 blind man, a young blind man. Let's see how they run. Now where can they run? Tied to a post and a blindfold put on. A summary trial, defence there was none. 306 trembling boys they saw gone. Shot at dawn, shot at dawn. 1 blind man, 1 blind man. He thought that they'd run. There's nowhere to run. I'll wear the enemy down with men. Attrition will work, I'll send thousands of them. No thought for their lives and the consequence when the war is won. The war is won. 1 brave man, 1 brave man. This Tommy from Leigh in the fields of France found himself in a dangerous circumstance. Pinned down by flak, then he took a chance under great fire. through barbed wire. Alfred saw several men had died, failing to rescue those trapped inside enemy lines, so he went and tried to save each man. One brave plan. He dodged bullets and just got through, got help for the stricken from his HQ. He earned a VC at a place called Maru. One brave man. Our brave man. One brave man. One brave man. He saw how it was run, knew he shouldn't have gone, went to war and saw the truth, that killing is evil, he needed no proof, couldn't live with his grief, nor stay aloof, died with Anne, one brave man. Saw the carnage, knew his mistake, knew he couldn't kill, so for conscience' sake, he and his wife an accord did make, to thwart their plan. Shadrach and Anne, they found them there at the end of leave, arms entwined as the gas they breathed, their families destined to ever grieve for this brave man and his wife Anne. One brave man, one brave man. He went to church, knew the Bible said, "Thou shalt not kill, choose peace instead." The lesson learned, it filled his head for all his life, wouldn't use the knife. Arthur knew it was wrong to kill, refused the gun and refused to drill, joined thousands of others who had the will to make their stand, one brave stand. 3 years he wasn't allowed to speak, a coward, a traitor, deluded and weak. His jailers taunted, but he stayed meek through all that grief for his belief. 3 blind men, 3 brave men. Could it happen again? It might happen again. The men in charge send the troops to fight. Their motives are vague, but their speech is bright. How tragic to think that they have the right to waste more lives, to waste more lives.
Despite the government attempts in 1914 to defer the problem of Irish Home Rule until after the war ended, some Irish nationalists, although in a minority, were not willing to wait. A Dublin-born former British consul, Sir Roger Casement, had returned to Ireland on his retirement and in November 1914 travelled to Germany hoping to gain support for Irish independence. He was unsuccessful in this and also in his request for German officers to aid in a planned uprising in April 1916. He returned to Ireland on a German submarine, believing that the planned rebellion could not succeed and hoping to get it delayed. He was arrested a few days later and taken to London, where he was charged with treason in that he incited an armed uprising against the British government. On Easter Monday, 24th of April, the rebellion started when Patrick Pearse, a teacher and lawyer, read a document from the steps of the General Post Office proclaiming an Irish Republic and a provisional government. 2,000 supporters, armed with weapons supplied by and smuggled in from Germany, occupied the post office and other government buildings. The British government declared martial law, and the rebellion ended on the 29th of April when British infantry surrounded the post office building and Pearse surrendered. The people of Dublin had not been sympathetic to the rebels, but the mood changed when the British condemned 100 men to death and started executions in early May. 15 rebels had been shot before the executions were halted in response to public outrage. The treatment of the rebels caused a great rise in anti-British feelings. Roger Casement was hanged on the 3rd of August at Pentonville Prison. Under a provision of the 1916 Police Act, policewomen were given a legal standing. At the start of the war, the government had been opposed to the idea of women joining the police force, and when people were asked to volunteer as special constables, it was expected that the applicants would all be males. However, calls for women to volunteer came from 2 sources. The first was a journalist named Nina Boyle, The second, Margaret Damer Dawson, a well-known philanthropist and anti-vivisectionist, who had become concerned that female Belgian refugees who were supported by a committee she was a member of were being lured into prostitution. With the agreement of the Chief Commissioner of Police, the two women joined force and formed the Women Police Volunteers. Boyle left in 1915 after she was defeated in a vote over whether or not women police in Grantham, Lincolnshire, should be used to impose a curfew against women. The group's leaders were now Dawson as Commandant and Mary Allen as Sub-Commandant, and its name was changed to the Women Police Service, which later became the Women's Auxiliary Service. The organisation first worked in London, but in 1915 Grantham became the first place outside of London to form a women's police force to help with the problem of prostitutes being attracted to the town because of the large numbers of troops stationed at two nearby army camps. In August 1915, Edith Smith became the first policewoman to be given powers of arrest when she was sworn in at Grantham Police Station. She was also the first to be paid, receiving £2 a week. In 1914, a senior policeman had commented that they should go back to their kitchens. By 1916, they had proved their worth to the extent that the Admiralty recruited one of them to work in an undercover role at Scapa Fell Naval Base, where she was required to search out spies and drug users.
Tommy's had to go back today. Grace was trying so hard not to cry, poor girl. 4 days leave. That's all he had, but long enough for them to get married. The wedding was lovely. Tommy so handsome. Grace, well, she looked a picture. We were a bit concerned about the rules of dressing up extravagantly. But I got the new hat. Grace's dress was beautiful. Her mother made it. Her mother had a new hat too. Do you know how much Tommy paid for the wedding ring? You never guess. £2. That's more than a week's wage. I couldn't believe it. But, like he said, Grace deserves the best. That's true. She's an angel. Puts her heart into her work at the hospital. Her Tommy's so brave. All my lads are. I hope to God they say.
WPC Green 476-2309. Report of an incident, Wigan Railway Station, 17th of September 1916 AM. I was on the first part of my duty this morning at the train station in Wigan. I had registered in at the station office on arrival with the duty officer. He reported no incidents and a fairly normal flow of passengers. The weather was wet and it was a dank, dark day. I suddenly noticed amongst the black and grey of the umbrellas and passengers a uniform of a soldier. The soldier stood out in the crowd and was shouting. Closer inspection showed he was not shouting to a pal or to anyone in particular, but seemed to be in a state of confusion. His confusion rose to an almost fever pitch, and suddenly he removed his rifle from his shoulder and started to charge into the passengers who were descending the staircase, with his bayonet raised. I pushed forward to get nearer to the soldier. I feared he was suffering from some sort of shock disorder. I reached the soldier and managed to hold him back from the crowd, who all dispersed very well all around him. It was now clear that he thought he was back in action in the trenches. An off-duty sergeant major came forward to help, and we managed, along with the station duty officer, to get him into the ticket office. A medical officer was then called, who took over the situation. He thanked me and said he would get the appropriate help. At 3 o'clock the same day, I checked back into the station, who reported that the soldier returning home from France on a 7-day leave had been taken to the army medical officer. The soldier was sedated and would be receiving further help from the medical officer.
Early in the year, British soldiers from the Sherwood Foresters, who were stationed at Ypres, discovered a printing press abandoned by its Belgian owner. It was repaired by a soldier who had been a printer, and in February was used to produce the first issue of a trench newspaper called the Wipers Times, Wipers being the British pronunciation of Ypres. The paper's editor was Captain F.J. Roberts and sub-editor Lieutenant F.H. Pearson, both of whom had been mining engineers before the war. The newspaper used weapons of satire, comedy and black humour as an antithesis to the reality of life in the trenches. The editors and other contributors frequently copied the style of local English newspapers. For instance, letters to the editor complained about potholes in the roads, or suggested starting a fund for repairs to a crack in the local church spire. A later edition had a letter complaining of feeling nauseous when newspapers published photographs of peace rallies in Trafalgar Square. The writers parodied nursery rhymes, poets and famous writers. Sherlock Holmes became the hero of short stories under the name Sherlock Sholmes. Adverts offered day trips to Belgian spas. Unpopular journalists were lampooned because of the style and content of their reports. Betting odds were offered on weather forecasts, with odds of 8 to 1 on chlorine gas. While there were other trench newspapers, there were probably none that were printed so close to the German lines. The newspaper ceased publishing in February 1918 at the onset of a huge German offensive on the Western Front. But 2 final issues did appear at the end of the war. They were written in the usual humorous style, but the editors did express a concern about what they would do now that the war was over. The horrors of peace were not for them, and they longed for a nice war to retire to. In November and December of 1915, 2 conferences had been held in France at the headquarters of General Joffre to decide the Allies' strategy for 1916. Italy had entered the war in 1915 on the side of the Allies, and the German-Austrian alliance was now facing a war on 3 fronts. The decision